Great. So thank you all very much for having our paper on the program, both Marina, Michal, and all the organization. And the starting point of our paper is, we believe, one of the kind of biggest questions in economics and finance over the last few decades. So why is it the case that we observe pervasive discrimination in economic and financial choices across different domains? So what's the idea in particular why we care about discrimination as economists? Well, that in particular, it could be two different types of discrimination. The first form, which started at least with Phelps in 1965, is what we call statistical discrimination. So the idea that in a setting where there is severe asymmetric information about the quality of counterparts, for instance, borrowers in a lending setting, it might be useful to use some demographic characteristics of these individuals that might in the population correlate with certain characteristics, which also predict performance going forward. Now, this form of statistical discrimination would be a form of an unbiased belief. So it's true, actually, that in the population, that demographic characteristic correlates with certain performances. Now, another much more detrimental form of discrimination is what we call bias discrimination, which could take the form of taste-based discrimination. So I have utility from not interacting with certain demographic groups. That's why I don't want to give them borrowing, for instance, or other forms of bias beliefs. So I believe that actually that certain demographic characteristic correlates with a certain performance in the day that doesn't. And so for that reason, I'm making a decision which is ill-informed. And now, if we wanted to separate these two potential forms of discrimination, the major empirical challenges the literature has faced, first of all, we need a setting where we can separate these two forms, in particular when thinking about the outcomes of discriminative actions. So is it the case that the decision maker is improving their performance by discriminating, which is what statistical discrimination implies? Or is it the case that the agent is making worse decisions in terms of performance, which is what bias discrimination suggests? And then, of course, we need to observe choices that have some substantial cost to the discriminating agent, because only in that case we can understand whether economic incentives might amend potentially these biases. And so what we do in this paper is we propose a setting that we believe can help us do a step forward in this dimension. What we will look at is a peer-to-peer lending platform in India, where individual lenders like me, yourself, anybody else, these are not institutions, that can provide the funds to a set of borrowers. Now, the crucial feature, and the reason why we think this is a relevant setting for the question at stake, is that this platform introduced a Robo Advising tool throughout the sample period we have available. So the idea of the Robo Advising tool is that this is an algorithm that proposes lenders matches of borrowers that have risk characteristics similar to what the lenders want to invest in. Now, the crucial feature of this Robo Advising tool is that it doesn't include demographic characteristics when making these allocation decisions. So what we can do in this setting is that we can compare lenders' choices before and after accessing this Robo Advising tool, and of course across different types of lenders. Now, we think that this setting in particular is unique for the question at stake, because in this setting we are decoupling the risk assessment of the characteristics of borrowers. So the lender doesn't have to make an inference regarding the risk characteristics of the borrowers, which are decided by the platform, and the lender observes this decision. And therefore, this scope for statistical discrimination, which might still be there, implemented by the platform, is something that would be going above and beyond what the lender can do. Now, the very last piece is in terms of motivation is that we look at India. This platform is in India, so why India? Well, first of all, the short answer is that that's the only setting where we could find a Robo Advising tool, one of these algorithmic decision-making for which we could get data in these lending decisions. But also because in India, there's at least two important sources of cultural biases that have been studied in the sociology and cultural econ literature. The first one is a form of in-group versus out-group discrimination, in this case in particular between Hindu lenders and Muslim lenders. So the idea is that these two religious groups have been clashing over decades for several centuries, but especially after the independence of the country. And so Hindus tend to favor Hindu in-groups, Muslims tend to favor Muslim in-groups. And also a form of implicit bias, what in the Western world, for instance, we call often the forms of gender bias, the idea that when we think about the quality of, for instance, female leaders or female CEOs, often even women themselves tend to believe that actually female are worse at those type of jobs than men. So a similar type of implicit bias exists also in the case of India, based on the caste system, a very rigorous system in which we have a group which is at the very bottom that has been shown in a large set of research. I will say a bit more later. They themselves have negative beliefs, worse beliefs about the quality of their own people that are similar. I will skip the literature, of course, just to mention that we believe this paper fits in a kind of a very nascent work on robo advising, which is very, very broadly intended as algorithmic advice that we can give to non-expert decision makers. So far, the literature has mainly studied what are the effects of this type of robo advising tools on performance. The way in which we use the robo advising tool here is mainly instead to create benchmarks for rational decision making, what we as economists would call standard neoclassical decision making. Now, in terms of the data, what we use, we have a large collection of several data sets. Some are proprietary to the platform we look at. We observe borrower and lender characteristics, of course. Now, the platform is completely blind in terms of the two crucial demographic dimensions, which are important for us for the cultural biases, which is religion and caste. And so we obtain this information for these individuals we have in the platform through external matrimonial registry data. Now, we have information then, of course, on the characteristics of these loans, interest rates, maturity amounts, the performance of these loans over time, because the platform also services the loans. So we do observe who pays, how much, and so on. And then finally, of course, the usage of this robo advising. And now let's start then with this first bias I mentioned, the Ingroup versus Outgroup discrimination. So what I'm showing you, I will show you mainly results in the form of graphs. So what I'm showing you in these pictures is what is the difference between the decisions that lenders make before accessing robo advising relative to after accessing robo advising. And so if we focus, for instance, on this picture at the very top left up here, what we look at is what is the likelihood that Hindu lenders decide to choose a Muslim borrower to whom to provide borrowing at different points in time. The black bar refers to the decision before these lenders access robo advising, and the red bar refers to the decision afterwards. We can see that indeed Hindu lenders tend to provide funding to Muslim borrowers less likely than what they provide instead borrowing to Hindu borrowers that we have at the bottom of this picture here. Now, if we look at Muslim lenders in the right panels, we see that, again, the flip side of this sort of decision-making is true. So Muslim lenders actually tend to provide lending to Muslim borrowers much more likely than what Hindu lenders were doing, if we compare these two black bars here. And also they provide instead lending to Hindu borrowers less likely to do so relative to what the Hindu lenders do towards the left here. Now, what happens once the robo advising tool is introduced? All these ratios are actually equalized. So what we observe is that both for the case of Hindu lenders and for the case of Muslim lenders, all of them start to provide lending exactly the same likelihood to Muslim borrowers. Same for the Hindu borrowers, so both Hindu lenders and Muslim lenders provide funding to the groups in a very similar way. So the way we interpret this is a very raw data, raw-based data. In the paper we have more multivariate analysis too, but the way we interpret this result is that it seems like that both of these groups seem to be biased, providing funding to their own in-group beforehand, and after the robo advising tool is introduced, actually these ratios are equalized. Now, another dimension in which we can study this issue of funding and the biasing is looking at the intensive margin of the usage of robo advising. Because the idea of this platform is that after the lender has accepted to use the robo advising tool, which is called the auto invest, they can also decide which fraction of their resources they have on the platform they decide to allocate through this tool. So they will keep allocating the remaining fraction on their own. So that gives us then some kind of intensive margin variation where we can look at those lenders that do activate the robo advising tool, but to the left here, they only allocate a small fraction of their resources through this tool. They still keep mainly allocating resources on their own. Up to towards the right, here in the x-axis, those lenders that almost completely rely on the Robo Advising tool when making decisions towards their right. And so on the y-axis here, for instance, I'm showing you what is the share of Hindu borrowers after usage of the Robo Advising tool for Hindu lenders. And this is associated with the blue line. So we can see that for those lenders that have activated the Robo Advising tool, but they only allocate a small amount of resources there, still the share of Hindu borrowers on their portfolio is pretty large. And this share declines quite monotonically, actually, up to those people that instead are almost completely biased towards the very higher end of this distribution. These are exactly the ones that are allocating more and more of the proportion of the resources to the Robo Advising. Of course, we can also look at this sort of analysis, not in the raw data, in more of a multivariate setting. Something I have to specify in the onset is that the decision of activating the tool here is endogenous. So we don't have a source of exogenous variation in the decision to activate the tool. But no, we can look at what happens before and after activation across the different types of lenders. Crucially, what the multivariate analysis buys to us is that we can restrict the variation within lenders. So we can only compare the decisions of lenders before and after activating the tool, absorbing any systematic characteristic that differs across lenders, including, for instance, the religion in this case. And so what we find is that as we add additional controls in these multivariate specifications, for instance, moving from column 1 to column 2, and crucially, as we add these lender fixed effects in column 3, actually the size of the estimated effects is almost completely unchanged. So we think, I mean, that this is a reassuring result in terms of this endogeneity issue I was mentioning before, because as we sort of add more and we increase the variation of the outcome variable, which in this case is the type of lender that is chosen by different investors, the estimated effects don't change much. And we can see that also, again, here, most of the effect is driven by those individuals that have using the auto invest tool quite substantially. So they give most of the resources to them. Now, another way in which we try in the paper to sort of speak to this issue of endogeneity is to exploiting variation, geographic variation in particular, in the extent to which this Hindu-Muslim conflict is salient to different lenders. So the idea here is that lenders are allocated in different locations in India, and they don't lend locally. So the whole idea of the platform is that you can lend to people far away from yourself. But still, lenders in those areas where the conflict between India and Muslim is more salient should be the ones, if this is a belief story, as we are trying to argue, that potentially display larger effect of these beliefs. So we use variation at the geographic level in various dimensions. Here I'm just showing you an example of that. For instance, the extent which across different Indian states, local populations support anti-Muslim parties, in particular in this case the BJP party, which is the party currently ruling in India. And we can see that the darker one of the Indian states here is, the higher this fraction. So we do have substantial variation across space. Of course, this variation by itself is not exogenous. So obviously there will be endogenous reasons why certain areas vote more or less for these anti-Muslim parties. But the idea of our heterogeneity strategy here is to consider then that lender, which is in a state like this one, Gujarat, which is extremely supportive of the BJP party anti-Muslims, might be displaying this bias more than a lender, for instance, in this southern state here of Kerala, which instead has a lower support for the party. And that's what we find in the data. So in this table, I'm showing you estimating again the baseline multivariate specification we saw before, splitting the sample across those for which we have a higher extent. So those lenders in areas where we have a higher extent of Hindu-Muslim riots happening over the last few years, we see that the effects are mainly driven by those people, both in terms of the bias before accessing Robo Advising against Muslims and the biasing afterwards. Also those areas where the voting support for anti-Muslim parties is higher, as well as those areas in which those type of lenders, younger lenders, that have been exposed to this type of rhetoric against the Muslims during their formative years. And the last, very last, I think, few minutes I've left, I wanted to say something also about the second bias we look at, this form of implicit bias that I mentioned, which is based on the caste system. The idea of the caste system is a very, very hierarchical social distribution of the Hindu population. In particular, one group, the Shudra group, is at the bottom of this hierarchy. Still today, this population is extremely segregated and discriminated, also in terms of occupations, marriage, markets, and so on and so forth. Now, crucially, some work in this area, including Duflo, Banerjee, they've shown the Shudra themselves have negative beliefs, bad beliefs regarding the characteristics, the abilities of their own Shudra. So one of the unique features that we have in this setting and that we exploit in our analysis is that castes are not disclosed on this platform, and that there is variation in the extent to which you can guess which caste a certain individual belongs to based on the information that is available, which includes their names, their surnames, their occupations, and so on and so forth. So here, just to give you a sense, we build on some work by previous authors like Bhagatuval and others that actually provide an algorithm that, based on these pieces of information, occupation, names and surnames, and so on and so forth, it computes or estimates the probability that it's actually possible to assess from the information that is available on the platform whether a lender and a borrower are Shudra or not. So we can see that a large bunch of these people, it's pretty obvious, they are Shudra based on this information, but there is also a lot of people for which this is very hard to assess, including a lot of people for which this probability is actually pretty low. They are Shudra, but it's hard to say based on this information. And so what do we find? Well, if I look again at the decisions in terms of choosing, in this case, Shudra borrowers by any of the lenders, if we consider everybody who's in the platform, including those people for which it's almost impossible to recognize whether they're Shudra or not, we don't seem to see any bias in the choice of Shudra borrowers before auto-invest is implemented relative to afterwards here. Now, what happens if we only restrict the analysis to those Shudra borrowers that are more and more recognizable as Shudra? So here I'm getting those that are somewhat recognizable. Already we can see that before the Robo Advising tool, this probability declines. For those for which it's almost obvious that these are Shudra, a probability of recognition above 70%, that's exactly where the bunch of this sort of bias lending is concentrated. They get much less smaller lending before relative to afterwards. And so the very, very last thing, and then I will conclude regarding performance. So I mentioned that, a crucial distinctive features of the two forms of discrimination is that statistical discrimination should improve performance. Biased discrimination should worsen performance in terms of utility, consumption utility, because it's a mistake to think that those people will perform worse. And that's exactly what we find in the data. Again, very simply here in graph, because we don't have time, what I'm showing you here is the CDF of the likelihood that different groups of borrowers repay, in this case, their lenders. So the green line here refers to those borrowers that have a low probability of being Shudra. So those for which it's not really likely that they do face substantial discrimination. The orange line instead is the CDF for the Shudra borrowers that it's almost obvious they are something like Shudra. And so we can see that when I look at the percent of the overall amount paid on the x-axis, the orange line is shifted to the right. So these high probability Shudra were actually performing much, much better than the others before the Robo Advising tool is introduced. Now, if the Robo Advising tool improves the performance because of the biasing, lenders, we would expect that these features change in the sense that the green line now shifts also to the right. So the improvement in performance is mainly driven by those that were facilitated before. And that's exactly what we find. So after the auto-invest is introduced, the CDF for the performance of these individuals that were favored before moves to the right towards the other people, and the differences are almost completely disappeared. So I think we are kind of out of time. So just let me conclude here, and very much look forward to Enriqueta's comments and all your questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Francesca. And we have Henrietta discussing. So look forward to your comments.
Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper. I really liked it. I think it's also a very interesting and important question. I'm going to summarize it super quickly because Francesco did a great job in presenting, and then I'm going to give you the comments. So the question in this paper is there taste-based discrimination in P2P lending markets? And if yes, what are the effects of this discrimination? And specifically, the paper is set in India. They use a Robo Advisor called FairScent, and they focus on two types of taste-based discrimination. Ingroup versus Outgroup, in this case, Hindu versus Muslim, and with Ingroup discrimination that is based on the caste that people belong to. Their empirical strategy is to exploit the fact that at some point the Robo Advisor introduces an automatic tool to pick before and after the introduction of the tool, and also cross-sectionally comparing people that use the tool heavily and people that use the tool less or not at all. And the main findings are that in-group borrower loans are about, in one case, 9 percentage point more likely to default. So this is a huge difference. That they find that the extent of the biasing from the tool depends on how much you use the tool, which indicates that it seems that there was some bias and the tool debiases people. And then there is more bias in areas with conflicts, in areas that support the party that is anti-Muslim, both now and also in the past, meaning the experience of people matter as well as their situation, today. So these are my comments. The first is like whether there is some space for statistical discrimination and what's its role. So as a reminder, you know, taste-based discrimination, I don't want to deal with some group. Statistical, I think that this group actually is the worst, conditioning on all the observable characteristics, and therefore I refrain from lending to them because I think I'm going to do a bad deal. And of course, ex post, you can check whether the statistical discrimination is borne out in the data or not. And so here, the authors argue that the website does already a lot to assess the risk and to screen the borrowers. So, for example, people need to get into the platform, so if they have their credit is too bad, they get excluded. Once they get onto the platform, there is a second step in which there are human employees of the website that check employment, compare the face of the person to the ID, and they do various other checks. And then finally, people get categorized, quote unquote, if I understand correctly how the website works, into different, let's say, risk buckets based on their credit score, but also based on other characteristics like the size of the loan, the employment, and so on. And so the idea is that here there is less latitude for the lenders in assessing the risk of the borrowers. This being said, though, it is possible that the lenders still think that they can do some statistical discrimination. They see a bucket with 100 people and they are, okay, so these buckets based on observable contains people that are similar according to the algorithm. But maybe I have an insight about, you know, what is a good borrower and what is not based on my experience or other thing. And so they truly act thinking that they are doing statistical discrimination. Of course, I'm sympathetic, and there is a lot of evidence in the paper that it seems to be test-based, but just, you know, to be devil's advocate, it is possible that some of the lenders at least have this perception. And so I'm wondering if you guys know about the experience on the website, if you have some way of distinguishing whether your result of test-based discrimination is due to animus, meaning I really don't like the other group, and I know that I'm leaving money on the table, but I don't care. Or it is instead based on, I'm not very experienced, maybe I'm ignorant, I think the out group are not good borrower, like factually not good borrower, and I just, you know, act on that. But the longer I am on the website, the more I observe the situation and the more debiased I should become. by myself. Then, and Francesco has already hinted about that, I think another part to discuss is whether there is some selection in the tool adopters. So, and again, one thing that could be, we could look at is whether they have experience, because the paper basically compares people that adopt the tool either late in the period or earlier in the period, but everybody at the end of the story has adopted the tool at some point. And this is people that make the endogenous choice or adopting this tool. So is it possible that these are people that think they have less experience, and so they feel like, you know, I'm going to adopt this tool because I'm not that good at making these decisions. And as a result of that, this might be also the people that might think they are doing statistical discrimination, but they're actually making a mistake and losing money. So it would be interesting to see if there is some way to at least describe what are the characteristics of the lenders that go toward the tool as opposed to the ones that don't. And also a question that I have in this respect is, can people change the choices of the tool? So the tool gives me a suggestion, and then I go in and I say, well, you know, I'm accepting 100% of those suggestions, or like I really don't like those 2 or 3 suggestions that you gave me, because this could be another dimension over which we can check. After all, if I have animus and I'm truly biased, the moment if I'm Hindu, the moment the tool tells me, oh, there are these 3 great Muslim borrowers, I should say, I don't care if they are great, I really don't want to lend to them. On the contrary, if I am distracted or if I have less experience, I must say, oh, okay, sure, maybe I wouldn't have picked them, but now that I have them in my portfolio, I'll keep them in. It also would be great to know more details about how the website itself works, and I know that this is there is going to be a new version of the paper coming up, so this will come up. So how is the process determined? Does everybody that passes all the screening get a loan? Is it only a matter of having different interest rates? Do they get different quantities? What happens if I ask for $10,000 and only $8,000 is filled? Does the company put in the difference? Or is my loan cancelled? Is my loan maybe shrinked? Conditional on me being okay with that. And it would also be interesting to know a little more the way the tool operates. So does the tool ask you some sort of like risk attitude and then allocates across the buckets equally? If there are like a lot of people in one bucket, how does the tool pick them? Randomly? Does it pick the ones that are already getting more funds from other people based on the time they get into the bucket, or what is the criterion? It would be interesting to know. And the question in the background, in addition to maybe exploiting all these features to provide further support for the analysis and for the thesis, it's also to understand, does this tool have any bias? How does the tool decide? And, you know, is there something embedded in it? And is it possible, like, is like the debiasing, I would say, absolute, or is it just relative to a much more biased situation that we see with the humans deciding? And also it would be interesting to see what other additional information people that decide by themselves have about these borrowers and that the tool ignores. So we know that they can see religion and they can see caste, or at least they can infer it. Is there anything else that they can see and that the tool ignores, and that potentially could be an alternative reason why certain borrowers are picked over others? And I'm comforted by the analysis that the authors do about adding additional characteristics and finding a coefficient that is stable across the specification, but it would still be interesting to know this. Another question that came to my mind when I read this paper was like, what is the role of the human officers in step 2? Like, is there anything that is discretionary and that they can embed into the screening process? So if they don't accept you, you don't even get onto the platform. If they accept you, do they classify you in certain ways? And can this classification affect the results? Can this classification affect the humans more than the tool? Or do they use the same guiding principle as the tool? And finally, this I already told you. It would be also interesting to see what is the welfare effect for the borrowers of the tool, the introduction of the tool, the presence of certain lenders versus others. And this would be both for the borrowers that are on the site already. And so they would, I think, if I understand correctly how the tool, the website works, they have a higher likelihood of getting a loan, maybe get higher quantities and lower rates, but also in some sense encourage other borrowers to join. Because in some sense, if you think that this website is discriminating against you, and maybe all the websites are, if you are in the minority, it's possible though that you are discouraged from applying, and it's possible that, only very high credit quality minority borrowers, like Outgroup borrowers, apply. And then when that changes on the extensive margin, we may see also differences there as well. It is possible still that even if the tool chooses people in proportion to their proportion in the population, so seems blindly to, let's say, religion, it still might be the case that the minority, the Muslim borrowers that show up are positively selected compared to the rest of the population. So I have, I think, 1 minute or 2 minutes left, so I'm going to conclude. This is a great paper. It was a pleasure to read it. It's a very important and interesting question about discrimination, and it would be interesting to see even more analysis and more exploitation of the features of the website to separate these like taste-based discrimination from maybe statistics, but even more important, explaining what is the mechanism behind it. I look forward to the next version, and thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Henrietta. So first of all, that was a great discussion, and I think you covered most questions, at least that I had. So I guess both Francesco and Alberto, if you guys want to take time to kind of answer some of the questions, otherwise I'll just have to repeat them. And then I'll open the floor if anybody else has questions or suggestions.
Yeah, no, so thanks a lot, Enriqueta. These are all super great points. I think, I mean, from the first to the last one, I'm sure Alberto agrees. I mean, some things we had, some of those we had talked about, some we hadn't. So these are all great points on things to do going forward. And so just, I mean, a couple of points on a couple of the things you mentioned. So in terms of like the point of inaccurate statistical discrimination, so the idea that it might be that still these people believe that they're doing statistical discrimination, but that's accurate exposed. That characteristic they're using is not really predicting better performance going forward. Yeah, so the way we think about it is, so that's what's in a sense why we titled the paper, you know, our costs are cultural biases more than taste-based discrimination, because we are bunching these two things together. Now, I agree that we could sort of discuss about, you know, these are kind of three forms, like proper statistical discrimination, inaccurate one, and taste-based discrimination. So we are bunching taste-based discrimination and inaccurate beliefs as a one thing, and that's what we call it cultural biases, in the sense that, you know, it's a bias because exposed this was an inaccurate belief, and it's based on the cultural characteristics of these people, or the demographics and so on. So most of the results in the paper cannot separate the predictions of those two. They're the same. So the only result that I think goes a bit in that direction is something I didn't show at the very end, but the fact that when we look at the Shudra borrowers, so these caste individuals, so we see that indeed the idea of implicit bias for taste-based discrimination would suggest that they discriminate more against their own similar, whereas in this case, the inaccurate statistical discrimination prediction, if anything, we would expect potentially should be lower for them, because they are the ones that know the other Shudra much better than what people in other castes would know the other Shudra. So we would potentially think that they can form a better belief about whether these people are good borrowers or not going forward. And yet we see that they discriminate those people more. than the other. So that's the only test that we think, I mean, can maybe speak to that. And the only second other point I want to mention about the welfare effects, because yeah, also we completely agree, it would be great in the end to have a bottom line. And I didn't have time in the conclusion slide to talk about it. You know, the main issue now thinking in terms of welfare is that, so when we think about consumption utility, you know, we have those results and we see that these people are better off in the sense that they earn more. But of course, if your utility function includes, you know, some utility from the fact that, you know, you are not interacting with somebody you hate. This is what I remember Matthew Rabin at Berkeley used to call the asshole preferences. Or, I mean, a positive spin on that. Maybe you want to help people that are of your same group and you don't want to help somebody who's from another group. So you get some utility out of that. So unfortunately, we cannot measure that utility. Now, by revealed preference, what we find in the app is that these people, after they've been allocated different borrowers, so borrowers in other groups, they don't change. So that's also something you were mentioning, and I should have mentioned, we should mention better in the paper. So we do observe whether these people can actually revert the decisions of the Robo Advising tool, and we find that they don't. And so in a sense, I mean, that at the minimum suggests that it doesn't seem that these people have very strong sort of preferences against the out groups or the ones that were discriminating before, that potentially these were more a bit of a subconscious bias. But yeah, ultimately, you know, because it's very hard to quantify that portion of utility, it's hard for us to say people are necessarily better off with this tool, which also means, you know, in terms of policy implications, you know, I wouldn't suggest that the policy implication is that now everybody's forced to invest through the Robo Advising tool because they should be free to give their money. This is not a public bank or an institution. So these are people that provide their money potentially in a form of charity, even if you want. Yeah, but and also all the other points, great, literally. So thanks a lot. Yeah, we good notes and we'll be great to have the slides.